Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute's Town Hall. I'm Susan Hoffman, Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning and the Director of OLLI at Berkeley. It is wonderful to see you, both familiar faces and those joining us for the first time. OLLI Town Halls began back in January 2016 as a way for us to come together to make sense of current events, their social, political, and civic meaning. Today feels especially meaningful as we begin our next decade of town halls. This is our 31st, roughly speaking, town hall. For this town hall, we waited until the week after the holidays to choose our topic, which has been inspired by the recent campaign, election, and inauguration of New York City's Zohran Mamdani. Remember those hopeful days, that first week of January? Renee Good and Alex Preddy had not been murdered, and as yesterday's New York Review of Books headline reads, as they dared to be a witness to interfere with the Trump administration's efforts to normalize abductions and state violence. It is now a crime to be a witness. We will talk about this and other topics next week, February 6th, with campus colleagues Henry Brady, Paul Pearson, and Eric Schickler. We hope you can join us then as well. Today is perhaps an aspirational exchange of ideas based on how government can serve human need. This OLLI at Berkeley Town Hall looks at democratic socialism not as an abstract theory or ideology, but as a set of governing principles grounded in democratic accountability, public institutions, and shared prosperity. We will draw on the expertise of our roundtable, which will look at taxation, local governments, and comparative political economies. Our panel will explore how these ideas translate into policy, budgets, and everyday decision-making. As always, we begin with Darren Zook, Professor of Politics and Global Studies from Berkeley, who teaches not only on our campus, but each term at OLLI at Berkeley. Darren will introduce each of the speakers. Please feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat. Darren will read them. And if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand, though we may not have enough time for everyone. We are recording today's town hall, and we will decide later how it will be shared. Finally, a word of thanks. The idea of OLLI town halls was Darren Zook's, and he has served as our thoughtful facilitator and commentator from the very beginning. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Darren Zook.
Hooray! Thank you for that, Susan, and thanks to all of you for being here. Good morning. We are going to keep things as we always do, informative, but also kind of informal. So yes, as we're going along and talking through each of our panelists, feel free to put any questions or insights you have in the chat on Zoom here. I'm going to get things going by sharing an anecdote with you, and this comes from a previous lecture I gave in the OLLI program. I was talking about how Adam Smith was one of the most misunderstood figures in the development of economics and capitalism because people often forget that he was not an economist, he was a moral philosopher. And I was talking about how Adam Smith's basically was developing a theory of moral capitalism that was not simply governed by laws of supply and demand. And I had a question or a comment from an OLLI member that said, I didn't realize he was such a utopianist. And the idea that we could have a capitalism that also had a sense of morality, the fact that we interpret that as kind of so unreal speaks a lot to our sensibilities here in the US. We're going to hear from our panelists, for instance, how you can look at capitalism very, very differently. You know, how Denmark approaches it, or Norway or something like that, how they might approach the idea of what capitalism is, as opposed to shareholders looking at what are called stakeholders instead. Got lots of stuff to share with you. The other thing I'm going to say by way of introduction is we're talking about democratic socialism today, And in the US, at least, we tend to use the phrase democratic socialism and social democracy interchangeably. That is not correct. Social democracy is something that's different from democratic socialism. I believe our panelists will, in some way, speak to that. And if not, I'm happy to do that, or we're all happy to do that in the Q&A period. The last thing I'm going to talk about is, since I talked about how we can view capitalism differently, Zoran Mamdani has a very tall order to fill, not just in terms of implementing policies, but also in terms of changing a mindset. Even here in Berkeley, where we like to think we're all maybe on the liberal side of things and progressive, if nothing else, when it comes to economics, everyone seems to think that there's this law of supply and demand that we just can't question in any way. There is something called translatability of concepts. If you want to have a Danish capitalist system, we kind of have to also have Danish values, which means we have to change the way we look at economics and the way we look at the link between society and the economy. And there's many of the reasons why we have so much to talk about. And the good news is I don't have to talk about all of it myself, because we have wonderful panelists to help me here. And I'm going to introduce our first panelist here, who is Robert Strand. Robert Strand situates democratic socialism within a global comparative framework, challenging the assumption that American-style capitalism is the only viable model. Through the lens of Nordic political economies, he examines how democratic capitalism, anchored by strong public institutions and labor protections, can deliver freedom, innovation, shared prosperity without abandoning markets. Robert is the executive director of the Center for Responsible Business at Berkeley Haas and the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley. Robert, I give the digital floor to you.
Darren, thank you so very much. And all the good OLLI folks, thank you so much for having me. I am the executive director of the Nordic Center, as well as the Center for Responsible Business here at UC Berkeley. And I want to give a call out. The Nordic Center would not exist if not for the Oshers, Barney and Barbara Osher. And Barbara Osher in particular has established the Nordic Center here at UC Berkeley. So OLLI is a legacy of the Oshers. The Nordic Center is a legacy of the Oshers. So that upfront gratitude to our good friends, Barbara and Barney Osher. I have also the privilege of being on the faculty here at UC Berkeley. And for the last 20 years, the last 10 plus here at Berkeley, prior to that at the University of Minnesota, I've run courses where I take American MBA students, capitalists, to Denmark, Sweden, and Norway on annual study tours. And we consider ideas of capitalism, of socialism, ideas of democracy. And I want to say just a couple words about that, hopefully plant a few seeds for a conversation. Here in the US, I'm an American, but have spent significant time in the Nordic region as a Fulbright scholar and then as a PhD student and as a professor. And we have some different ideas about what capitalism is, what socialism is in this part of the world, in the United States. And I would argue a lot of that very much formed out of the Cold War. And a lot of the rhetoric of the Cold War is alive and well here in the United States. And words like socialist, it invokes a response, either very negative, very positive, but it's a vessel that we fill. And I often find that we have some arguably unconstructive debates when we use these sorts of labels. And I like to get down and be a little more specific on what we're talking about here. So we have treated a lot of times, now I'm going to paint with a broad brush in the US context, capitalism, socialism, as if it's on a single dimension. And I would suggest that we at least add one more dimension to this. So if you imagine on the y-axis, we can talk about concentration of power in society. And this brings us to ideas of democratic, of oligarchic. And in the classes that I run here at UC Berkeley and take these students to the Nordic region, I draw from a book that I've been workshopping and it'll finally be published in April. It's called Nordic Capitalism. And here I describe the United States as being a version of capitalism that we could say is now oligarchic capitalism. Hyper concentration of power in society. whereas the Nordic region has democratic capitalism, where we have more dispersed power. And that dispersion of power is very important. And here I will draw from a UC San Diego sociology professor, Lane Kenworthy. This is a great book, Would Democratic Socialism Be Better? And Lane offers the quote, the Nordic model of capitalism achieves virtually everything that contemporary democratic socialists say we would want. Access to healthcare, access to education, access to paid parental leaves, access to childcare, strong labor unions, more power dispersion in society. So the final point that I'll make here is that I would argue many times, not all the time, but many times some arguments that we have in the United States can be more along identity lines, lines of I'm a socialist, I'm a capitalist. And I would suggest that perhaps we adopt a pragmatic approach to determine what are some of the things we desire. I think we all desire that kids should have access to health care. The Nordics have figured out how to do that in a capitalistic context. And I think that there's some lessons for particularly our American business leaders. I get the privilege to be with our MBA students, American business leaders to advocate for many of these things that democratic socialists advocate for. Healthcare, childcare, paid parental leaves, strong labor unions, because those so-called self-professed capitalists in the Nordic region, they realized if we want a good, strong, robust society and a good, strong economy, turns out access to healthcare, access to childcare, these things actually make for good business. And then they don't have to worry, those Nordic capitalists don't have to worry about all those things that we plug into benefits. In the US context, they can just focus on business. So with that then, Darren, I will hand the floor back to you.
All right. Thanks for those insights. I have so much more to talk about, many questions of my own. I'm sure all the members do as well. We're going to keep things moving on in our introductory first half hour here. I'm going to switch gears here a bit and bring in Lenny Goldberg. Lenny Goldberg brings a long view of tax policy as a democratic tool, examining how revenue systems shape public capacity, equity, and the social contract. His work highlights the political choices embedded in taxation and their consequences for public services and inequality. Lenny, the digital floor is all yours. You need to unmute.
Wow, I was muted there. Very hard to give a presentation when you're muted. Thank you. One of the things, just in terms of the current democratic socialist events, I noticed that the big debate between Kathy Hochul and Zoran Mandani is the question of allowing an increase in taxes, which Mandani wants on corporations and the rich in New York City, and she has said no new taxes. And this has been kind of the standard argument that I've worked with forever. In looking at tax policy, and there's some contradictions among them. For example, we look at tax policy with regard to income distribution and progressivity, but we also look at it in terms of financing, adequate financing of the many needs: healthcare, childcare, housing, public safety, infrastructure, the tax policy, the broad social needs, as well as the specific distributional questions of who pays and who benefits. And this is in constant conflict. We use a very heavy sales tax in California. We use pretty high taxes on the wealthy, a corporation tax that's loophole ridden, but is still higher than in many other states. It still needs a lot of work to be done. A property tax that is currently a mess in terms of financing local government, particularly on the commercial industrial side, which I've done so much work on over many years. But as an example, in looking at adequacy needed at the state level, one of the failures of the sales tax is that it fails to tax what many of us spend our dollars on, which are digital goods in one form or another, subscriptions and all kinds of things, not part of the sales tax. On the other hand, that would tax the ordinary people, young people, people, all of us are online. And so the sales tax being very limited, to make it more adequate to finance the public sector, you've got to look at perhaps broadening it to products that are used by ordinary folks. And right now, the general attitude of the public, and I would say is often the case, what I've been saying for years polls very well: close loopholes, tax the rich. And the question then becomes, is that an adequate way of talking about it? Now, with regard to the question of democratic socialism, from the tax perspective, it's really more social democracy. We want to raise substantial amount of money. We want to raise it mostly from the rich and privileged, and we want to pay for adequate human services and infrastructure, et cetera, all the social needs. On the other hand, I've worked on things such as a state bank for California many years ago, a public oil companies. And so I would argue that the distinction between social democracy and democratic socialism is that in democratic socialism, there are some pieces of public sector, such as our Medicare system, in which you actually have direct public investment in economic facilities. Now, I just want to raise one irony for our later discussion. Trump has gone out and taken pieces of Intel, getting pieces of NVIDIA when they invest in China, different ways in which the public sector, the federal government, has started to engage in what one might call, more traditional socialist activities, which is involvement in direct economic production or ownership of some of the means of production. And in his case, it's a question of patronage and oligarchy. But it's very interesting to see this little shift in the question of public ownership of private resources, which I would say is the distinction between the tax policy work that I do, in which we're trying to fund a broad range of the public sector, versus taking some direct ownership stakes in productive forces. So I'll leave it at that, moving on to the next presentation.
All right. Thanks very much for that, Lenny. We are going to move on to our last presenter for our panel here, and that's going to be Daren Fields. Daren Fields grounds the discussion at the municipal level, where democratic ideals meet real-world governance. With decades of experience in city management, Fields explores how values such as participation, transparency, and community well-being are operationalized through budgeting, land use, and public safety. Daren, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Darren. It's nice to be here. I served over 30 years as a department head, assistant city manager, and city manager for several municipalities in California. Very exciting. We have a new mayor in New York City, but I guess I'm here to provide the reality check of bringing democratic socialism to local government in California. Local government in California is officially nonpartisan. So people are not elected as a Democrat, a Republican, or a Democratic Socialist. There's no party affiliation next to someone's name when they're running for office, when you're looking at their name on the ballot. There's also an old axiom in local government. There's no Democrat or Republican way to fill a pothole. There simply isn't. Local government in California is focused on providing core services such as public safety, police, fire, emergency medical services, typically makes up a half to 2/3 of a city's budget. Services such as public infrastructure, so streets, sewers, storm drains, sidewalks, water, power, typical city service, but also planning and zoning, which governs land use, regulating the type and use and the density of buildings that are built within the community. In California, these are all provided by cities, counties, and special districts. New York City, which we have a new mayor in, is a very different animal. It's unlike any other city in California or in the United States for that matter. You start with the fact that it has a population of 8.5 million people. If New York City were a state, it would be the 13th largest in terms of population. New York City's annual budget is around $112 billion. If New York City were a state, that would be the third largest budget amongst any state in the country. New York City also has a city income tax, which is very unusual. In fact, in California, no city has a city income tax. It's actually outlawed by the state constitution. So New York City has a lot of financial resources, right? It has a lot of money with this budget, but even still, it needs the state of New York and oftentimes the federal government to help pay for all the programs and services that it provides. The new mayor is going to need approval from others also. He can't act alone or in isolation, whether it's the New York City Council or some other governing board or body. I noticed, one of his signature proposals was free childcare for children from 6 weeks to 5 years of age. So unlike California, where K through 12 education is provided by a local school district, in New York City, the schools are actually run by the city. So it's under his umbrella. They pay about $34 billion a year annually for the school system. But even here, I noticed that the mayor is already finding that he can't afford to provide this type of service alone. And he's already gone to the governor of New York looking for additional funds. So the upshot is, while it's great to see something new and different, he doesn't have unlimited resources. And he's not solely in charge of what he can do there in New York. He also needs to pay attention to those core city services, which are nonpartisan by nature. I found it very interesting that he spent a large part of his time earlier this week dealing with the snowstorm that descended upon New York City. You've got to pay attention to issues like that. He does have the ability, though, to steer the conversation and push for new ideas, new ways of government providing services. He did a great job of bringing people together during his election campaign. However, governing is a little different, and building community, which he really focused on in terms of his campaign and his efforts, that's a little harder when you're governing and you're faced with new actors in the political and governing arena who may not agree with you, who really are sort of working against you. Because local government is closest to the people, it is by nature the most accountable of our public institutions. In California, by state law, meetings are open to the public. All debate must be held in public. All votes must be held in public. I really hope the new mayor is successful, because I always like to see local government be successful. I want to see how he can make government really work for people, bring people together. I look forward to seeing how he does. Thank you. Appreciate the time.
All right. Thanks for your insights, Darren. Before I go straight to the questions from our participants and OLLI folks, if you have questions, start writing them in the chat, and I'll get to them in a moment. I'd like to pose a question based on all of your comments here, and I'm going to start with an anecdote. I mentioned in my brief introductory remarks this idea of translatability, because democratic socialism, or if we call it social democracy, is more than just policies that we introduce. There's a context here. And I know, Robert, you've been to the Nordics. I have as well. I teach a class called the Nordic Lands, for instance. And here's the anecdote. At Norway's Halden prison, there was a day when the leaving shift of guards forgot to lock up the prison. And you might be thinking, oh, that's a terrible thing because all the prisoners escaped. In fact, what happened is when the next shift came in, the prisoners not only did not leave the prison, but they had gotten into the kitchen and made breakfast for the incoming guards. And if you're thinking, would that ever happen in the United States? The answer is no. So what it shows us is there's also a whole cluster of values, that link between the economy, local government, state government, national government. there's values that we have to change. And I'm curious to kind of give this question to our panelists. If you could identify what it is about us that we would need to change our way of thinking in order for democratic socialism to not have that Cold War stigma, as you put it, Robert, where would we start? So, Robert, I'll put the question to you first, since you probably have the most experience with trying to translate Nordic sensibilities to Americans.
It's a great question and comment. I'll start with my answer, and then I'm going to walk back. Universally subsidized childcare. That's where I'm going to start. That's a policy. And where do we start? Well, if I look at the Nordics and I look at, to the degree that from an outcomes basis, if we look at performance measurements of societal level indicators, it's hard to argue that the Nordic region isn't doing comparatively well. Not that they have all the answers, not that they're utopia, but comparatively speaking. And certainly when you compare the Nordics of today vis-a-vis the Nordics of 150 years ago. 150 years ago, the Nordics, the poorest part of Europe. So from a paired sample experiment, they've done something in these last 150 years. And what it is, well, it's not a big model. We call it a Nordic model. No, it was built brick by brick, pragmatically, trying some things out. And so I start with universally subsidized childcare because in an American context, in any context perhaps it is, you need to be economically viable. And subsidized childcare is something that for incrementally more income tax, people have to pay for childcare anyway. Most of us in the United States, I'm a parent, many of us are parents, childcare is crazy unaffordable. And that also hits business really hard because you have a lot of people in the workforce who are forced to pull out of the workforce, and especially women, because childcare is more expensive than working. And that hurts small and medium-sized businesses because they had very productive people. And I'll say the final thing on why I'm such an advocate of university subsidized childcare is you hinted with the Norway prison model, high trust society, United States comparatively low. And insofar as trust is an important thing, and many of us would argue trust is a pretty good thing to have in a society, we need to pragmatically mend the social fabric to build trust. And I can't think of a better place than childcare facilities where bringing parents together with the common project of their children. I met parents of children. I met UC Berkeley students who were teen parents of their kids, and my kids are friends with their kids. I never would have had the privilege of meeting many of these people, but all of a sudden we have a common project. I get to know people, they get to know me, we build trust. So I would just say starting brick by brick and not taking on the whole model, but where is a policy that we could advocate for? And for me, it's universally subsidized childcare.
Thanks for that, Robert. Next, I'm going to pitch the question towards Lenny because I'll share with you a comment. I had a conversation with a person in Texas once, and I said, what is it that brings all Americans together? And he said, the one thing that brings us together is we don't want to pay taxes. So how do we convince people that paying taxes is worthwhile? How do we change that mindset? Lenny, go right ahead. You're muted still, so please unmute.
Absolutely the right question. I had always had this thing with my kids. They would say, well, what do you do? What's your job really? And I would say, I'm for taxes. And they would say, how can we explain who is this person who's actually advocate for taxes when the rest of the world is against taxes? And it's definitely it's really a values and a trust issue. The trust issue is the people don't believe, and this goes to Daren Fields also, people don't believe, or they have to be able to see that they're getting something for their taxes. So, every measure that goes on the ballot says we have full accountability. We're going to look at this. It's transparent. You can see how the taxes are being spent. A major effort in California to try to create transparency so that people say, yeah, I'm for all that, or I would pay that tax if I knew where the dollars were going. And we do have an elaborate system, actually, of accountability in terms of in California, but still people don't believe it. And that's the highest level of trust. It's like, I'll pay the taxes, but they waste money. And I've been in polls and focus groups where the LA County in a shift just lost $900 million. And the focus group talked about how the Board of Supervisors had a catered lunch that cost them too much money for a couple $1,000s. So you have that, an awful lot of anecdotal. Every time the press says, here's a misallocation of funds or corruption in local government. And I would say in California, the level of corruption is far below many of the states that, particularly in the East where you had old democratic machines, but they still, one story of corruption is enough to turn them against taxes. The other thing is there's very different values that people put on different taxes. Oregon has no sales tax and hates the sales tax. California hates the property tax. In New York and New Jersey, they're paying twice the property tax we're paying in California for their local schools, and presumably have the trust that they see that the schools are actually much better there, or in Maryland and in places with very high property taxes than they are in California. So and then the question is who gets taxed? And of course, people have the value that why would you tax us when, and they understand both anecdotally and actually truly in terms of the data, that wealthier people are not paying their fair share of taxes, corporations are avoiding taxes in various ways. So it's a key question. It's everybody is united against taxes. And I have this very difficult job of convincing people that, well, they're actually a good thing.
Thanks for that, Lenny. I'm going to turn now to Darren, and we have the same problem here with whether it's local government or anything. I mean, most Americans think that politics is something that happens to us, that we have no control over, and we don't trust it, and therefore, rather than participate in democracy, we kind of suffer through it almost. So, from your perspective, in terms of whether it's local government or anything else, in addition to getting us to think that taxes are a good thing, how do we get people involved in a process to think that it's something that we do as opposed to something that happens to us?
Well, I think large part of it is education in terms of most people don't understand the distinctions between local government, state government, and federal government. They see what's going on in the national news, and they really import that to themselves without realizing that democracy is a participatory sport. And if you're going to participate, you're going to have to spend time and effort on it. And at the local level is where you can make the biggest difference. And if you're not participating, you're letting it happen to you, especially on the state and federal level. If in the local level, you're closest to your council members, your school board members, you can have the biggest impact, but you have to participate. You have to go to council meetings, school board meetings. And I think you have to sort of understand. I think Lenny Goldberg hit the nail on the head when he talked about, taxes in California versus in other states, the trust factor. There's always this tension between the individual and the community. You mentioned that, in the Nordic countries, there is community. There's a culture of community. In the United States, and I can only speak California, which is where I live, and I've spent my life, is very individually focused. And there's always a tension in government on the local level where you're trying to address the sort of the concerns of the individual while hitting and addressing the needs of the community. And taxes are where the rubber meets the road because you're taxing people individually, but you're having to do it on a community basis, meaning you're trying to do it. The purpose behind it is for usually a community good. And so you have a need, a desire you're looking to address in some fashion, and you're trying to you're looking for the financial resources to address it, whether it's to do better lighting, better streets, better storm drains, whatever you have, and you're trying to come up with the funds to do it. Interestingly, right before I started in local government, I worked in state government, and I worked with Lenny Goldberg 45
Yes.
years ago.
Hello, Darren.
I was just enthralled by Lenny because he was such a maven when it came to tax policy. So I start working in local government and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to apply these tax policy perspectives to my job as a city manager. The unfortunate part, though, is that really I'm looking to raise X dollars in revenue and I have only so many tools to work with. And I'm just going to tax. I only have, when you're looking at the fairness of it, you're basically having to exclude that and just say, I'm trying to raise X millions of dollars. I only have so many options and I'm just going to go forward with it. The way you get around that is you talk about transparency and accountability. And when you can see where the money's going, you have a better chance of, in a sense, selling it to people that this is worthwhile. The federal government's really good about talking about waste, fraud, and abuse. But there is no Department of Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. You can't point to that. Now, on a grand level, there is obviously needs always room for improvement. But on the local level, it's, again, the rubber meets the road, and there's not a lot of, I really haven't run across any really waste, fraud, and abuse. There's individual cases, but overall, not so much. If you're able to show that, and you're able to govern effectively, you're going to build that trust and allow people to do it, and to do the taxes that you need, and to hopefully over time push the value system away from the individual and more toward the community. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for that, Darren. In fact, I'm going to build on that final point here because I'm going to turn our attention towards the questions from our participants now, or the folks at OLLI. So if you really want to disparage something in the US, you can just call it socialist or communist. And you talk about individuals and communities. I love the fact it's like every time we talk even about public transportation, there's always at least one politician who's like, a bus is just communism on wheels. And I'm like, not really. But so the first question we have that rolled in was basically that this, the dialogue can't really get started because the term socialism and communism, given the history of the United States, we'll stick with socialism for now, is just so loaded with historical baggage that it's a go nowhere discussion. I mean, even when Mamdani was elected, you had commentators saying, didn't he get the memo about Cuba? It doesn't work. So, if you had a different vocabulary to propose for how we might switch the discussion towards all the policies and programs we're talking about, if we're not going to call it democratic socialism, what should we call it? And I'll give it all the panelists a chance to kind of give a new term to it if they want to. So I'll go back to Robert first. Robert, do you want to call it Nordic capitalism? What would you like to call it?
Yeah, thank you. To go back to if we put capitalism and socialism on the x-axis, and that's typically how we've discussed things in the United States as a result of the Cold War, and we assume that American capitalism is capitalism. Anything else is on the slippery slope to Soviet socialism. I would suggest we need to add a Y dimension to that, and then we can talk about power concentration in society. Because it turns out all those folks, Milton Friedman, et cetera, in the 20th century that were warning about Soviet socialism, when we read Milton Friedman, he will say things like, with history as our guide, the greatest threat to freedom is the concentration of power in society. And Milton Friedman at the time assumed that the only way that power would be concentrated in society was with a strong state in the hands of state bureaucrats like the Soviet Union. Well, as we see decades unfold, we can see power concentrated in society in the private sector, in the hands of a few, we can call them oligarchs. And that's where we see oligarchic capitalism. So what I would suggest is that we talk about democratic socialism, oligarchic socialism, Soviet Union being an example of that, democratic capitalism, oligarchic capitalism. and where democratic capitalism, an example in practice in the world, is Nordic capitalism. Oligarchic capitalism, an example of the world, is American capitalism. And here I would suggest that many folks that are self-described as democratic socialists actually could see a lot from Nordic capitalism that they would draw from. And the final point that I'll make there is this idea of taxes. Oh, it's so essential. And in an American context, we often don't get past the discussion of tax rate because we assume tax rate, higher tax rate equals socialism, lower tax rate equals capitalism. Whereas in the Nordic region, I often hear people talk about, well, what do we get in return for those taxes? And if I get more value for what I pay, then I like it. I would prefer to pay nothing for this coat. I got it at a flea market in Copenhagen, and I paid about $10 for it. So, you know what? I'm pretty damn pleased paying $10 because I got more in return because I think this coat is pretty nice. And we need to get beyond just saying, what are you paying in taxes to? What do you get in return? And that's a more pragmatic, nuanced conversation that I would suggest we need to have here in the States. So final thing, Darren, democratic capitalism. That's what I'm advocating for.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And that is a sharp looking coat, I will have to say. Lenny, any thoughts on how we can change our vocabulary to get people more tuned into this conversation?
So you like your bus example. It's classic in focus groups, particularly around healthcare, where people say government should stay out of our healthcare. It should be run like Medicare, which then is like, what are you going to say from there? In other words, the government can't do anything well, except they run the most efficient healthcare system that is run by government and paid out by government. But people view it as somehow because it's good, it must not be government. I mean, it's really a classic thing that you see in focus groups, and I'm sure Daren Fields sees this stuff about what government should or should not be doing. But I'm really not sure about the phraseology. I think, for example, the whole healthcare debate, it's like Medicare for all, implies socialism. On the other hand, a public option for people to opt into Medicare, which would, I think, be substantially effective against the insurance companies that if people had the option and the employers had the option to choose a Medicare policy, that would lead us eventually to some kind of reasonable health system. It was knocked out during the Obamacare debate. On the tax policy, as I said, people really don't tax me, tax the other guy, and in particularly tax the rich, close the loopholes. That is a successful rhetoric. I'm not sure where it leads in terms of the socialism question. As a young socialist way back when, I kind of agree that the phrase scares people and social democracy seems to be a better one. But the question of really entering into, say, industrial policy, which is a form of directing investment into private sector resources. I had always, until Trump now, had often argued that when we're giving away all these subsidies, particularly tax breaks and tax subsidies in the state of California, that we should take some equity shares and get some of that back. That is probably legitimately a socialist concept in terms of being co-owners of some of the private sector resources. That it doesn't matter what you call it. It's really getting a fair return for public investment, and we're making all these public investments through our tax system by giving one tax break after another and getting very little back for it. So it is the question of, is there some public sector return, public community? You can say public sector, you can say government, you can call it, the broader community concerns, which I think Daren Fields did a very good job of suggesting that. So, I can't say how you identify or call them, but you do need public options. You do need public equity, public returns to the investments that we make so heavily in the private sector so that the community can, there was something once called, I think back in Zbigniew Brzezinski in the 70s and 80s, called it communitarianism. There was a communitarian movement. So there's different rhetoric you can use about it, but it really is getting, about getting community benefits, getting public benefits for all the private investments and private subsidies that we're doing. And in terms of healthcare, there was a little noticed piece by Frederick Hayek, the guru of the free market, who said, "Oh, well, in the case of health insurance, that is a public good and it has to be spread broadly and publicly." So a little bit different from Robert Strand's point of view about childcare. I've always thought that if we really had a true universal healthcare policy, there would be much stronger sense of community and responsibility, one for another in this society.
Thanks for those insights, Lenny. I'm going to go to Darren next, and then after that, I'm going to bring in Harry Chotiner to offer his insights on how we talk about socialism. So, Darren, any thoughts on how we might rephrase the debate to get more people included in this?
So I'm since I worked in local government, I like everything to be nonpartisan, so I'm not really big on labels. But I did like what Robert came up with. I thought democratic capitalism is a pretty good term. But in addition, his other sort of point that he made, that you need to sort of see the value of what you're getting for the taxes that you're paying, that's incredibly important. I learned that very early on when I would try to go forward to the city council or the community and say, well, we need to raise this fee or we need to raise this assessment, simply because we needed to pay for things. It's the cost is going up. And the response I always got was, well, what am I getting for it? And I realized we need to do a better job in government of explaining that, in a sense of marketing what we're doing and why we're doing it, and what you're getting for your money. I actually thought one of the I guess my most proudful moments in city government was the fact that I raised millions of dollars annually from the great citizens of Albany, California, without much of a peep from them, because we spent so much time and effort explaining, here's the fee, here's what we're raising it to, here's what it's generating, here's what it's going for. So it was a constant building of trust and transparency in terms of what you're getting for your money. So there wasn't a lot of pushback from the community, but it took a lot of time, it took a lot of effort, a lot more than I ever really wanted to. And I felt, in all honesty, I needed to, because I was trained as a city manager and people should just listen to me. But that's not the case. You need to really toil in the vineyards, if you will, and get, plant the seeds and let them sprout. And it's hard. It's hard work to build that trust and transparency. I mentioned it's a participatory sport democracy. You gotta, if you're gonna change values, which is what we're talking about, from how we look at socialism and capitalism to something different, you have to spend a lot of time doing it. I joke, when I started this business, I was 6 feet tall and had a full head of hair. And now look at me. I mean, it's hard. Anyhow, I appreciate it. That's it.
All right, and we're going to come back to the issue of social trust a little bit later, but right now I want to give Harry Chotiner, who is very familiar to most OLLI folks, a chance to offer his insights on this discussion as well. Harry, go right ahead. You're muted.
Darren, thanks. And I just wanted to thank everybody who is doing so well at suggesting things we need to think about. And I just really have only one insight, and I'm not even sure it qualifies as an insight. In terms of labels, when we were doing the most political groundwork I've ever done was in Santa Cruz, and it would often be, well, you're a socialist, you're this or that. And we would say, I don't care what you call us. Do you understand what we're trying to do? If you will say that you understand and can show that you understand what we're trying to do, I don't care about the label. And that sometimes worked. But the only really thought I have, and it goes a lot to what Darren was saying about Mamdani. And, I realized he's going to make a ton of mistakes. They're going to be mistakes from lack of experience. They're going to be mistakes because he's dumb or blind about some issue. There are going to be mistakes because he's listening to bad advice. There's going to be mistakes because his job is nearly impossible. And when those mistakes happen, I think it's really important that we acknowledge them, we embrace them, and we learn from them. And we build on mistakes rather than trying to deny them or hide from them. And the way I think about talking about mistakes comes from one of my two favorite political speeches, which was Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 gets nominated to run for a second term. And he gives his speech in Philadelphia. And one of the things he says, talking about what they've done in the first New Deal, he says, governments can err, presidents do make mistakes, but the immortal Dante teaches us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted on different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the consistent omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. And to me, that is the best thing we have going towards building trust, is if we can say, let's not get hung up on labels and look what we're trying to do. We fuck up all the time, but look where our mistakes are coming from, as opposed to what other people are trying to do, whether they're doing it successfully or not. Judge us on what the warm-hearted are trying to accomplish in society. And I do think at the deepest level, that's the difference between Democrats and Republicans. I really do believe that. It's a level of compassion and what your heart is like, if it's cold or it's warm. So anyway, that's just one thought. Thank you to everybody.
Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing that very much, Harry. In fact, one of the questions that rolled in, one of the insights that rolled in from one of the OLLI participants was, basically questioning whether the word compassion is a word that we can't use anymore in American politics. So speaking of politics, we have a cluster of questions that have come in about politics, and we'll call it democratic capitalism, I guess, for now, or we can keep to our whatever we want to say here, since we're talking about democratic socialism, whatever we want to call it. The questions are basically asking two things. One is, since socialism, at least in part, is associated with public ownership of key industries as opposed to complete private market, someone is saying basically, should we approach something closer to what China does, where you have direct government involvement in economic planning? And someone else is saying basically, could democratic socialism or democratic capitalism ever work in a two-party system? Because most of the countries we're comparing this to, such as Nordic countries, are parliamentary systems that have coalitions where it might work better. And since, Darren, you have probably the most direct experience of the panelists directly in kind of how government works, would you like to speak to either of these issues?
Sure, just briefly. In terms of the first part, in terms of public ownership, I'd be hesitant to do that. That's my first kind of knee-jerk reaction, because government is not in the business of doing certain things. And in California, you have this issue come up a lot as it relates to housing. Why isn't there more housing being built? And people are going to their local level, sort of build more housing, build more housing. But cities and counties don't actually build the housing. It's built by the private sector. They might provide certain guidelines or regulations to allow for more housing being built, but they're not in the business themselves of building the housing. And I'm not so sure they would be that good at it. I'm a little hesitant to just say the government should go into public ownership without sort of knowing a little bit more about what areas that is, and how it would be done. And in terms of the second one, can you have more parties? I'm going to defer to others in terms of the multi-party system, because again, I was on the local level and there was no parties in theory, meaning that it was all nonpartisan. I did have at times people elected to city council that I served that turned out to be members of the Green Party, for example. But you didn't know that prior to the election. they didn't advertise themselves as running as a Green Party member. It was just nonpartisan. They're running as an individual. And I had people who ran and then were elected as a Republican, and people I think were surprised at that after the fact. Again, nonpartisan. So I will defer to others to answer the question about multi-party system and whether that would work in this country or not.
Okay, Lenny, any thoughts on either public ownership of strategic parts of the economy or whether a two-party system will prevent us from ever having a good system of democratic capitalism?
Not on the two-party system, but I did find it interesting that the Biden administration did really the first big steps towards industrial policy. That's not specifically public ownership, but it really is, here's how we are going to direct private resources. Now, the use of tax benefits and tax credits, I have some skepticism about it, often rewards activity that would otherwise take place. But in the case of an industrial policy, which was really about green capitalism, was about moving towards actually doing what China, and I saw in the chat somebody mentioning how China's industrial policy effectively moved towards green policy, very successful green policy, selling all that to the rest of the world. That the industrial policy debate has taken place over many years, going back to the so-called deindustrialization of America in the 1980s, and pushed by a number of people, and then brought down because let's say Solyndra, that they made a mistake and they put the money in the wrong place, or the company went under, which is, again, an example of failure. What stands out to the public are often examples of failures rather than examples of success. But I do think that question of industrial policy is a different way of talking about, if not direct public ownership, but the public direction of private resources. And, of course, that's been entirely rolled back in the interest of a insane anti-climate ideology. But, that is a piece that we will need to explore a whole lot more.
Thanks for that, Lenny. And I'm going to turn now to Robert and ask the question of whether the Nordic countries' coalition governments, which require some type of working together, is the key. Can we really pull this off with a two-party system or not?
Well, I think there is some incredible benefit in societies that can encourage consensus building. And I think that we all can see right now here in the United States of America how it's unfolding, where there can be almost incentives to not build consensus, to, othering and the enemies. So I wouldn't put that all on what our government system is and structure, but I do know that I like democracy. I believe in democracy and fundamental democracies to be able to build consensus. So I think we can see some things where a parliament, where you need to build coalitions, of course, might have some advantages to our system here. But that doesn't mean that we can't do things to build consensus in other spaces in society. And I just want to emphasize a point that's coming up here throughout, and that is the need for pragmatism, I would argue. A need for looking at common ground. What are we trying to achieve? And I think that almost all of us would agree that we want a good society and future for our children. I think we can agree on that. And then as we start, we might think about different means to achieve that. But I want to emphasize here that pragmatism. And if I could read a quote from The Economist, this was a decade ago. They had a special issue on the Nordics, and they called it the next superpower. And a quote from that 2013 Economist said, "The main lesson to learn from the Nordics is not ideological, but practical. The state is popular not because it is big, but because it works. A Swede pays more taxes more willingly than a Californian because he or she gets decent schools and access to health care." I want to emphasize that pragmatism, because when it also comes to ideas of ownership, should we have public ownership of some entity? I've learned from the Nordics where they say, let's try private ownership, let's try markets, and we need to craft markets with good policy. And where it fails, let's try something else. But I have some suspicions if we just say we need to make this publicly owned, just off the set. So it emphasized that pragmatism. And the final point that I'll mention on there too is that very different ownership models. There is a lot of public equity in Nordic-based firms, but unlike Soviet socialism, the public sector is not operationalizing, it's not running, it's not the management of these companies. So you can have 10% ownership in equity, you can have 50% ownership in equity from the public sector without managing it. And that's something that I heard Darren say before. I'd be a little cautious about having the public sector running more things than what it necessarily needs to run, needs to manage.
Thanks for that, Robert. And I am going to come right back to you because we have another cluster of questions, which are specifically about the Nordics, which we talked about politics and coalition building. These are mostly questions about society. And the questions hint at the idea that what makes the Nordics works is that you have small, racially homogeneous populations, that's what really is behind all of this. I'll mention this. Most of you might know this, but for instance, in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the far-right parties are making increasing gains with this argument that, in fact, too much immigration is, in fact, undermining the homogeneity of societies, and that threatens the Nordic model and things like that. So I'm curious. I'll start with you, Robert, since it's mostly about the Nordics. Do you think that diversity is a liability in the way to democratic socialism or democratic capitalism?
Yeah, I'd say the comment, yeah, but they're small and homogeneous. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that, well, I'd probably have about $4,000. I've heard it a lot, and it's a very good and important observation. But I'll immediately start by saying, you know what? I know an even smaller and more homogeneous place that is entirely in poverty. And in fact, its people were fleeing, including my great-grandparents. And that is also the Nordic region of 150 years ago. And so smallness and homogeneity doesn't necessarily explain outcomes. And if we look at the Nordic region, a greater explanation for why is it that this is arguably the most prosperous part of the world today lies more in what policies have been implemented, what practices have been implemented in the last 150 years than necessarily small and homogeneous. And that said, though, of course, context matters. And so rather than comparing the Nordics with, for example, the United States of America, I think it's much more prosperous to look at a Nordic nation is about the size of a typical American state. You look at Denmark, you look at Sweden and whatnot. It looks a lot like I grew up in Wisconsin, lived in Minnesota many years. It looks like Wisconsin, Minnesota. So maybe it's better to do some comparisons at that sort of level. Then they look a lot alike. And the final point I'll just make here is that benchmarking. I grew up and went to school as an industrial engineer at the University of Wisconsin in the 1990s, and I was benchmarking the hell out of Japan and Toyota because of all the efficiency advances of Japan and Toyota. And then in Rochester, Minnesota, at IBM, which happened to be the world's largest IBM factory there, that was my first professional job. And I could apply lessons from Japan and Toyota in a radically different environment, Rochester, Minnesota, with IBM. And by many measures, Japan is the most homogeneous country in the world, and yet we could benchmark effectively. So I would just suggest that we keep an open mind, because I also host a lot of people from the Nordic region who come here to the United States to study what we're doing. And I haven't once heard, yeah, but you're big and heterogeneous. I can't learn from you. So I think there's something to be said of every context in the world is different. But the United States of America is not uniquely different in being different. We're all uniquely different. So let's learn from examples where we can draw some inspiration. And I think when it comes to things like learning from paid parental leaves and some of the other practices we see in the Nordics, there's a lot that we can draw from here in the United States and apply it in a different context with some adaptation.
Thanks for that, Robert. I'll give our other two panelists a chance to respond if they want to. Lenny, any thoughts on diversity?
And I think probably Harry knows this, but he could document this better than I. But the sort of general socialist understanding of the failure of the American working class, so to speak, to adopt socialism has a lot to do with racism and racial divisions and ethnic divisions, the sort of classic story of populists who are arguing for arguably socialist kinds of policies in the turn of the century, the populist movement, but also very racist, the use of Black workers to replace striking white workers, a long history in the failure of in historically the failure of the U.S. to develop a working class based socialist movement. And so I do think that, and then socialism just became an anathema with regard to, the word itself, as we've discussed. But I do think that and I think that's also true in tax policy, where people say, I'm paying my taxes on behalf of these poor, struggling people who are different from me, and I don't like them, and why should I pay those taxes? And in fact, the biggest issue in polling up to Proposition 13 was really with regard to the counties were paying for welfare, were what was then called welfare, and that the counties were burdened, and that was through the property tax. And much of the property tax revolt was based on people not wanting to pay their property taxes for these poor people, and it really led to very explicitly, ultimately very destructive tax policy for the state of California. And the state, one of the results of that was the state took on full payments and relieved the property tax of that welfare burden. But it's still, I think you see those ethnic divisions following in education, kids sending them to go to private schools or move to fancy communities that have really good education systems, then otherwise a resistance to paying taxes to educate those people. So I think it's a very strong theme throughout American history in terms of ethnic divisions. And as I said, yeah, Harry, you know a whole lot more about it than I do. Go ahead.
All right. I will first, Darren, do you want to add anything to this?
I was just going to add one
I'm going
thing.
to pass and wait for Harry.
I'm going to go here. I'll go to you next. Okay.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Lenny was saying, which is so right about working class unity and solidarity being divided by race and that being exploited by all kinds of people. But the other thing I'd say is we've spent now almost an hour over an hour talking about socialism, and I don't know if the word class has been used one time. And that's pretty interesting. And Darren was making the point about democratic socialism different from social democracy. And the point's been made about how far Norway's come since the mid-19th century. But all of that stuff is rooted in class consciousness, class movements, union movements. And I would just throw out one thought, which is to whatever extent democratic capitalism, the Nordic model or whatever, if they don't talk about class, and they don't talk about it a lot, though you know much more than I do, if they can transcend class, it's because they come from class. Class is fundamental to where things began and were built, and then they move beyond it. We didn't come from class. We've never had the kind of class consciousness, class solidarity, class movements, unions that function the way they have in European models. And so that's one of the many reasons why trust works differently, attitudes towards government work differently, civil society works differently, is because class is different. And I don't want to go on. Anyway, I just want to say, Lenny, that's a really great point.
No, and thank you for kind of enhancing those points and opening discussion up a bit. Now I will go back to Darren to see if you have anything to add to this.
I'm going to pass and wait for the next question.
Okay, fair enough. In fact, the next question, I want to make sure we get a chance to talk about this. It's come up several times. It is interesting we haven't talked about class, but maybe this will give us a chance to do that because there's a very key element. I'm kind of obsessed with this. Going back to the questions about homogeneity. the thing that brought me first to doing research in the Nordics happened to be the issue of corruption. And I can say there are many countries I have been to. I'll single out, for instance, Bangladesh, which is very homogeneous, maybe not small, but you have very low levels of social trust and therefore very high levels of corruption. So it isn't automatic if you have a homogeneous population that it's going to necessarily work better. And I can prove that through my research. However, the question of social trust seems to be the key to a lot of this. And I agree with Robert's comments when we first started that you have high trust societies in the Nordics, and it doesn't happen automatically. Social trust is something you cultivate. And not only are we a relatively low trust society in the United States, but I would say we are having a crisis of social trust because I would say it's actually going down. And the question I'm kind of obsessed with, whether it's at the local level right here in Berkeley or the national level, is how do we light that spark? Where do we start building social trust? And I'll go back to our panelists in the same order we started with, which means I'll give this question to Robert first and then go to the other panelists as well. Robert, any thoughts on how we spark social trust here in the United States?
Yeah, I think it's the common project of our children. It is very hard to find anybody, capitalist, socialist, red, purple, blue, whatever, who doesn't love their children. And it's very hard to find people who, when encountering other people's children and their children mixing with them, that they don't share some just empathy kicks in. To go back to Daren, you mentioned Adam Smith, and of course, Adam Smith, many people cherry pick that from his 1776, Wealth of Nations. It's not of the benevolence of the baker, the butcher, and the brewer that they, produce their goods, but not of self-love, that's self-interest. But if you go back to his 1759 Theory of Moral Sentiments, he starts the very first chapter. Adam Smith starts with, even the greatest ruffian feels a degree of sympathy just by seeing someone else's, either their pleasure or their pain. Empathy is so important for us to cultivate, and we need common spaces. And that can be childcare facilities, that can be softball teams, volunteer fire departments, etc. Those are spaces where we can actually build trust over time. And then just to add one point, yeah, the Nordics, again, they're not perfection. I'm holding them up here, but there's something we can learn from them. They were not always high trust societies. And if we go back 150 years ago, 100 years ago, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, talks about how Sweden was one of the most unequal societies in the world. And everything was dictated. You had a say in society based on property ownership and these sorts of things. And the capital owners in the Nordic region 100 years ago, it wasn't out of altruism. This is about 150 years ago, out of altruism that they said, hey, we want to enable you to have strong labor unions and let's build social trust. They looked around and they saw revolutions and they didn't want their heads cut off. And so the Nordic region benefited by having the Industrial Revolution coming a little bit later to them and being able to look around and see some bad things can happen if we actually don't partner with labor and figure out how to have a degree of shared prosperity. So this individual, George Lakey, who wrote Viking Economics, who is a self-professed socialist, would say, look, the Nordic region is not socialist today, but give the socialists credit for putting pressure on the capitalists to know that they had to partner with the social democrats in order to establish things like access to health care, paid parental leaves, and all these things that we now know today as the Nordic model. And those things help to build trust in a society because it's not othering. It's not, rich paying for the poor in these services. It's the middle class paying for itself is how many folks across the Nordic region look at their taxes and the benefits that they get from them.
Thanks for that, Robert. Next, I'll go to Lenny, see if he has any thoughts on how we might spark higher levels of social trust in America.
Well, I'm going to stay in my lane here. You remember the phrase by Leona Helmsley, only the little people pay taxes. And when you talk about corruption, the tax system actually is a system in many ways of legalized corruption insofar as large numbers of wealthy people can avoid paying their fair share of taxes through all kinds of, whether it's offshore or what are called like-kind exchanges in commercial property, on, the top, as we know, the effect of, as what Warren Buffett said, my secretary pays a higher effective tax rate than I do because of all the capital gains breaks and all that. So it's very hard, at least in my particular lane, to get the social trust that Daren Fields needs to get the taxes and at the state level when we have a system that's not. I would say our civil service is not corrupt in California. There are very few examples. Occasionally, there was a city in Southern California where they were ripping off everybody. I'm blanking on the name of that little city. And Emeryville used to be that way, a kind of little corrupt municipality. But the examples are pretty few. On the other hand, built into the system is tax avoidance at the high level and tax paying at the middle and lower level, including the sales tax, which hurts working families, who have to buy a lot of goods that are taxed by the sales tax and have to borrow money, so are paying taxes as a proportion of their income that are even higher. So in that sense, again, I can't speak to the big moral and trust issues, but I can say that the lack of trust in paying taxes, which is the belly of the beast, as far as I'm concerned, it's how do you support social democracy, if you will, are really, you don't have that trust because people are so-called not paying the rich are not paying their fair share of taxes, and that's very true. And so it's very hard to generate trust and the feeling that we're all in this together when those guys, and now we talk about the billionaire oligarchs, those guys in particular are not all in this together with us. Makes it an awful lot harder.
Thanks for that, Lenny. And of course, Daren, do you have any thoughts about how we can spark and build social trust and maintain it here?
Yeah, I think one way to rebuild social trust, and particularly through our public institutions, is to govern effectively. We really need to show the alternative to what's happening on the federal level by having states and local government run effectively. So that means city by city, county by county, state by state. Show the alternative, show that it can be done, show that there's a different way of governing and that we're serving the people and the public, and not just on an individual level, but a community level. That's going to be, I think, in the long haul, a good way of showing that government can work. And that is you can take away the chaos of the federal government, which is, almost like the plan of Trump and the Republicans, and say, but look at this state, or look at this city, or look at this county. It can be done, and it can be done well. And that's the model that we're going to use. Because without that, you're just going to be, it's somebody like you're going to be overwhelmed with mistrust on a national level, and you have to come up with a different path and a different plan and an alternative. So govern effectively. That's one of my solutions to how we're going to build social trust.
Okay, thanks for that. I do want to say just briefly here, I talked about this in my OLLI class just yesterday. I went over some of the Gen Z protests from around the world, but I do want to shout out a special welcome to any of my students who might be here today, because yesterday in my undergrad lecture on my class on political discourse, I mentioned this town hall, and all of them enthusiastically said, can you send us the link? Can I participate? Can I join and watch in? And so I think there's some good news here, which is that we have a generation that is often referred to as, snowflakes or people that are indifferent to politics, that are actually, if there's a reward for getting involved in this process of cultivating social trust, of making democracy work, of switching from shareholders to stakeholders, I think we're in good hands. I think there's a reason that Gen Z really responded to the rhetoric of Zohran Mamdani, when he was during his campaign to get elected as the mayor of New York City. We are officially in our last 10 minutes here, so what I'd like to do, as opposed to just posing questions to everybody, is I'd like to give each of our panelists, and Harry, I'll come back to you as well, a couple of minutes to either share your final thoughts or wrap up the thoughts you made, clarify any points you might have made, enhance any of your points you might make. And I'll just go through the same order, and I'll end with Harry, and then I'll turn it over to Susan to bring things to a close today. So Robert, anything you would like to add to our discussion that you haven't had a chance to talk about so far?
just to emphasize that we're talking about different terms. We're saying democratic socialism, democratic capitalism, and these terms are getting thrown out. I just want to emphasize the democratic part of it. Democratic, that is the common bond phrase here. And in all my years in corporate America, which was about a decade or so, and I did an MBA, an American MBA, and uh, that word democratic and democracy, I never heard in my American MBA classes. I never heard talking about it in corporate America. And the first time I heard that in a business setting, the word democratic, was when I moved to Norway as a Fulbright and talking about how do we use democratic organizing principles to run companies, for example. And so I just want to emphasize that democratic, and I wish the American business community, or I call upon the American business community to recognize that they have a very important role to play in American society, and that is being advocates, champions, fighters of democracy. And rather than seeing themselves as lobbyists for their company first, which typically means cut my taxes, cut my taxes, cut my taxes, to see themselves as lobbyists for society first, set up good rules of the game, establish markets that incentivize good behavior, punish bad behavior. And the best way that I know how to do all of that is through a strong and robust active democracy.
Absolutely agree with that. So thanks for those insights. Lenny, anything you'd like to add to any of your comments?
Well, yeah, I'm going to make a narrower pitch here because one of the pieces of democracy in California is the initiative process, which has been used actually to limit democracy by creating, supermajority vote requirements for taxes in particular, making it really difficult to enact taxes, and this is true for for the cities as well as for the state. There's a measure on the ballot this year which will overturn a democratic process in Los Angeles, which taxed the so-called mansion tax, which is an attempt to use the democratic process to restrict local democracy, which happens in the state. On the other hand, my partisan pitch is that we lost by 2 points in closing the hugest loophole in the state of California, which is the way commercial property is taxed, but will be likely because the legislative process really doesn't work very well, partially because of the 2/3 vote. We'll be back to the ballot in 2028, trying to fix this huge loophole and tax corporate property. So, the democratic process has kind of worked both ways in California, restricting cities, counties, and the state from enacting new taxes. On the other hand, forcing us to go to the ballot to do that, which means we have to really make our case about who pays and who benefits. And so, the whole democracy process in terms of referendum and initiative is a very interesting one in California and has actually had the most significant influence on state policy, more so than the legislative processes that we've been working with. So that's my much narrower perspective about battling day to day on the question of taxation, which gets us to the statewide votes in many cases.
Thanks for that, Lenny. And lastly, I'm going to go to Harry after this. But Darren, got a couple of minutes here to add something?
Yeah, really quickly. I think for me, when I think about all this, I think about community. It's all about community. And how do we, build community? And you could term it a socialist or capitalist or whatever, but it's really building community, and it starts from the ground up, and it starts from the local level. And for any of your students that are watching, at UC Berkeley, I really hope they participate because you can't sit there on the sidelines. I think we gotten to this point nationally because people were basically not active and involved. And my generation is sort of just let it happen. You have to keep toiling in the vineyards and toiling the soil and working it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with mistrust or no trust. So it's about community. And I would just say, give a damn. Start locally, get involved, and build from there. And I think that will make all levels of government much better. That's it.
Also agreed. You did with everybody. So one last person to refer to. Harry, do you want to add anything here?
But just one thought, which is I want to build on Daren Fields, who's sort of the poet of local government, local action, doing things, building trust. And the context I want to say, the reason that I think it's so important, besides what he's saying, we're so on the defensive now. What the Trump administration is doing at every level of human discourse, civil society, in every way, we're on the defensive every day. And that makes it hard to do anything. I mean, we're emotionally on the defensive as well as practically and politically, and it makes it very hard to do anything. And however the elections go this year, Trump's not going to change. He is, no matter what happens, he's going to be on the aggressive for the next 3 years, and we are going to be on the defensive for the next 3 years. And rather than despair and hope things change in 28, I think what everybody's saying is right, whether it's Lenny on fighting the tax battles and Robert's point about and creating a discourse of democratic capitalism and Daren's point about working on the local level. These are all things we can do while we're on the defensive and understand that this is a historical period where we're on the defensive. And God willing, it's going to change, but we have to see it for what it is.
So my sincere thanks to Robert, Lenny, Daren, and Harry for sharing their insights. Clearly, we have work to do, but let's go ahead and yes, give a damn and do it. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Susan and let her bring our town hall to a close. Susan?
And Daren, thank you. And each one of you, Robert, Daren Fields, Lenny, Harry, thank you all for your contributions to this discussion. It was a whole discussion, and we will intend to caption it within the next week and post it to people who registered for today, as well as put it on our website. It is likely to be one that the campus will be interested in as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you, panelists, for all of your heart, your empathy, your desire to communicate. I want to thank Darren Zook. Thank you for bringing in your undergraduates to this forum. We have many ways in which, and it's a lot thanks to you, Darren, bringing in the undergraduates. We are ourselves, OLLI at Berkeley, very focused on the intergenerational learning. We see it as a key building block to democracy. And so please expect that you will be seeing more of that as we go into this next difficult period. Let me also say that we have, for the month of February, remarkable conversations. I mentioned next week on what our colleagues are calling the backsliding of democracy, which I think they will up the caliber on that rhetoric. We will talk about Ukraine the following week. We'll talk about other things that are related to the intergenerational learning exchange. And then finally, we will end the month with a dialogue between Marian Nessel and Marian Standish on the questions of RFK, his new nutritional and health indices, and they will talk about the food policy and corporate control of our food production. So please come back, think about those Friday mornings, spend them with us, and thank you for spending today, everyone.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.